90 seconds. One question. And suddenly a live Fox News interview turned into a historical reckoning. In front of millions, Pete Hegseth thought he was going to crush a young African soldier. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't fight back with anger. He answered with a silence so powerful it sent chills across America. The camera panned slowly across a vast horizon of red dust and cracked earth. The sun, merciless and swollen, hangs above the West African plains like an eye that never blinks. The wind howls not with fury but with exhaustion, dragging with it whispers of stories long buried under colonial boots. This is Burkina Faso, a name that means land of upright people. But the upright have long been bent under the weight of betrayal. Once a proud territory of free tribes and fierce warriors, it became another blood-stained page in the French colonial playbook. The invaders came not with swords but contracts, not with kindness but conditions. The French called it haute volta. They gave it schools that taught French history and maps that erased native names. But they didn't build roads, at least not for the people. The only paths paved were the ones leading to gold, uranium, and cotton resources meant for Europe, extracted by hands that would never afford the bread baked from them. The land is rich, the people poor. That is not irony. That is design. In the crumbling village of Bobo Dioulasso, beyond the reach of electricity and fresh water, there lived a boy, Ibrahim. No last name was needed there. Everyone knew the tall, watchful child with eyes like two pools of black stone, still but unblinking. Even at age 11, he moved with a silence that unsettled the wind. He didn't play much. He didn't laugh much. But he noticed everything. There was one memory that stayed with him, a scar that never quite faded. It was a Tuesday. The sun was low, the air dry as parchment. A convoy of white land cruisers cut through the village like a blade. They belonged to a Canadian-French mining consortium operating under a friendly-sounding name, Terra Nova Gold. But the people just called them the Ghosts because they came, took, and left, silent, empty-eyed. Ibrahim stood behind a broken adobe wall, peeking out as the vehicles passed. Men in clean blue uniforms, foreigners and their Burkina Bay escorts, disembarked and were greeted not with protest but with silence. No one spoke anymore. Resistance had been traded long ago for hunger relief. That day, Ibrahim watched as two boys from his village, no older than him, dragged hoses to pump water for the company trucks. Not for the crops, not for their mothers. The well had been dry for weeks, but the water trucks came only when the mining officials arrived. The same night, his mother boiled stones in a black pot, a trick to keep the younger children from crying, hoping they would sleep, believing food was coming. Ibrahim said nothing. He just sat outside, his arms around his knees, staring into the dark. But inside, something began to burn. And here's what made it worse. The next day, a flyer was nailed to the village tree, written in French, of course, praising the economic contribution of Terra Nova and announcing a corporate social responsibility grant of $2,000 for community development. The money never arrived. The tree stood as a bitter monument to a lie. What Ibrahim couldn't understand then, what most of the world still refuses to see, is that this was never about incompetence. This was about control. The gold under their feet financed skyscrapers in Paris. The rare earth minerals lit up smartphones in New York. But here, in a land born from dignity, dignity was the one thing most had to sacrifice just to survive. That night, Ibrahim wrote something into the dirt with a stick. No one saw it. The wind erased it. But he remembered, if we don't own what's under our feet, then we are not standing. We are kneeling. Years later, the world would meet this boy, but not yet. First, he would watch, he would learn, and he would remember every name that sold the country for a briefcase of dollars. Because one day, and no one knew when, the boy with the silent eyes would return. But this time, not as a watcher, as the storm they never prepared for. Burkina Faso has no tradition of fairy tales. Boys don't grow up dreaming of swords and crowns. They grow up dreaming of full stomachs, dry roofs, and maybe the chance to matter. By the time Ibrahim turned 16, the ground beneath him no longer felt like a homeland. It felt like a waiting room. The village school had one book for every 8 students. His teachers were unpaid. His mother's hands had turned to leather from laboring in dry fields that produced less than what was stolen from them. There was no college on the horizon, no scholarships, no prospects. So when the military came recruiting, wrapped in national flags and promising 3 meals a day, he didn't hesitate. Not because he believed in their slogans, but because it was either the army or the grave. The training compound on the outskirts of Ouagadougou was brutal not physically but mentally. Discipline was expected, but obedience was demanded. There were no debates. Orders were truth. Dissent was weakness. Traoré learned to shoot to march to salute. But more importantly, he learned how hierarchy cloaks silence in the name of loyalty. He kept his head down but his mind open. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he reacted. In the quiet moments between drills and meals, he noticed the patterns, how certain commanders received calls from embassy numbers before operations, how the foreign advisors never wore uniforms but always controlled logistics, how aid packages meant for rural villages disappeared into private storage before they ever left the city. Still, he said nothing. What was a teenager supposed to do in a machine this vast? Then came the mission, the one that would crack his silence forever. It was a routine deployment or so, they said. A suspected extremist cell had been reported in Kulpelago province near the border. Ibrahim, now 19, was assigned to a transport unit meant to secure the perimeter for a joint op between the Burkinabe forces and a private French security firm. When they arrived, there were no weapons in the village, no fighters, just families and farmers, frightened and confused. They spoke in Moray, pleading for clarity. The interpreter shrugged. The foreign contractors weren't listening anyway. Then the company commander, a Burkinabe officer with a French-issue watch and a gold ring, too expensive for his salary, stepped aside for a private conversation with a French liaison. Ibrahim saw it. No one else seemed to care. What happened next was never written in any report. A bag was exchanged, cash clearly visible, and a list was handed over. 10 names, all men, accused without proof of aiding insurgents. The soldiers surrounded the village, called out the names one by one, and dragged the men to the center. The families screamed. The women wailed. Traoré stood frozen. This wasn't security. This was something else. Then the order came to burn the huts, and they obeyed. The fires rose behind them as the unit drove off. Ibrahim sat in the back of the truck, his rifle across his lap, but his hands shaking. One of the men they dragged out had handed him a folded paper. He hadn't looked at it until now. It was a school certificate. The man had been a teacher. That night back in the barracks, Traoré couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the snores and silence of the others. On the concrete beside his bunk, he scribbled a single question into the dust with his finger. Is survival worth it if it means forgetting who you are? He wasn't a rebel yet. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't anything more than a name on a roster. But something inside him had shifted, a fracture, deep and quiet. The boy who had joined the military to escape death had found a new kind of death inside it, the kind that killed conscience slowly, one blind order at a time. And from that fracture, the first flame took hold. Not loud, not visible, but real. The seed had been planted, and soon it would burn through everything. The military base slept under a heavy dusk, its concrete walls humming with generators and distant voices. In the dormitory wing, the rusted ceiling fan clacked above the heads of young soldiers who had learned to dream without sound. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't asleep. He sat hunched in the far corner of the barracks, just beyond the reach of the flickering bulb overhead. His uniform shirt folded beside him, a small battered notebook in his lap. He'd bought it from a street vendor for the price of a loaf of bread. The vendor had asked if he was writing love poems. Traoré had smiled and nodded, but love was the farthest thing from his mind. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear that had long since hardened into something else, but from the sheer weight of everything he couldn't say aloud. His pen moved with deliberation, as if each word was a wound being cleaned. They told us to protect the nation, but never taught us what the nation feels like. They told us to serve, but never told us who we serve. He paused. Outside, the sound of boots echoed faintly in the corridor. He waited, then continued. I watched a village burn. I did nothing. I obeyed. I was rewarded with silence. He looked down at the certificate, now creased and smudged, belonging to the teacher who had died in Kulpelago. He folded it gently, placed it inside the back cover of his journal, and stared at the page in front of him for a long while. And then, with a slow breath, he wrote the sentence that would define everything to come. One day we must no longer ask permission to be free. No slogans, no speeches, just truth written in ink. He closed the notebook and wrapped it in plastic, hiding it beneath the loose wooden plank, beneath his bunk, beneath where his boots rested every night. He would step on it each morning like a quiet ritual, grounding himself not in orders, but in purpose. The next day the drills resumed. The orders returned. The flags were raised again under skies that hadn't changed. But something inside Traoré had changed forever. He marched like the others, saluted like the others, but carried within him a blueprint, not for a coup, not for rebellion, but for reclamation. He had no army, no followers, no plan, just a promise made in solitude. The camera would later capture him in grand speeches, standing before thousands. But history would never see this moment, this quiet oath, this ink-stained declaration buried beneath a soldier's bed. And yet that was where the revolution truly began. The fire of revolution does not start with shouting, it starts with silence that refuses to obey. The training compound in Ouagadougou had begun to feel like a machine with no off-switch orders and silence out. Days bled into weeks and routine dulled the senses of even the most curious minds. But not Traoré's, not anymore. He had learned to hide the fire in his chest beneath layers of discipline and calculation. On the surface, he was an ideal cadet, punctual, obedient, unreadable. Inside, he was quietly studying the system's gears, how it worked, who controlled them, and most importantly, who still remembered why they were turning. That's when he met Colonel Mamadou Diawara, a name whispered with equal parts reverence and regret. Once known as a decorated strategist with a reputation for raw brilliance and revolutionary leanings. Diawara had all but vanished from the public eye after a failed political fallout a decade earlier. Now he was tucked away at the military academy, mentoring cadets in logistics and battlefield ethics, a quiet exile masked as an honorary role. Traoré was assigned to his advanced field operations unit. Most saw it as a dead-end detail, more books than bullets. But Traoré sensed something deeper. There was a weight behind Diawara's words, a tired precision in his eyes, like a man who had once tried to move mountains, but now chose to memorize their shadows instead. Their conversations began informally, often after class, under the brittle shade of the acacia trees lining the back fence. It was there, away from the noise of boots and rifles, that Traoré asked the question he'd been carrying like a stone in his throat. "Sir," he said one afternoon carefully, "did you ever believe we could change this country?" Diawara didn't answer at first. He lit a thin cigarette, exhaled slowly, and looked off toward the horizon where the training field faded into the dust of forgotten villages. "I did," he said finally. "Once. Back when I still thought the truth had weight." "What changed?" Traoré asked. The colonel turned to him. His voice was quiet but sharp. "In this country, those who speak truth don't live long." The words weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were surgical, the kind of truth that no longer bleeds because it has already scarred over. Diawara continued. "You see medals, I see lies, polished for ceremony. You think uniforms make us righteous? They're stitched from compromise. We were meant to protect the people, but we guard the gates of power now, and no one gets in unless they pay the toll." Traoré felt the weight of each word sink deeper. This wasn't cynicism. It was post-belief, the kind of realism that grows in men who once dared to dream but lived long enough to regret it. "But what if we still try?" he asked. Diawara chuckled, not mockingly, but like a man hearing a song he hadn't heard in years. "Then I suppose you'll need thicker skin than I had," he said, "and you'll have to be smarter than me. Because hope is a dangerous thing, Traoré. It doesn't just get you killed, it gets others killed too." He crushed the cigarette under his boot and stood. "You want to survive, learn when to speak. Learn when to bow. And most of all, learn who's listening, because there are ears in every wall." Then he walked off, his back straight, but his shadow curved as though the burden of surviving had bent him more than any battlefield ever could. That night, Traoré didn't write in his journal. He simply lay awake, replaying every syllable of that conversation. He didn't disagree with Diawara. In fact, he understood him too well. But deep inside, beneath the layers of fear, rules, and warnings, something refused to accept it as destiny. He would remember the colonel's warning, but he would not inherit the colonel's surrender. The academy may have trained soldiers in battle formations and radio codes, but it never taught them how to fight ghosts, the ones that wore suits instead of uniforms, spoke French with diplomatic immunity, and gave orders through back channels no one could trace on paper. Traoré began to notice the pattern long before most dared to acknowledge it. Official operations were increasingly being directed not from Burkina Faso's military high command, but through the polite suggestions of foreign advisors, men in pressed white shirts and polished shoes, who appeared before every major decision and vanished just after the damage had been done. They never carried guns, but they had more power than generals. Some called it cooperation, others realism. Traoré called it something else, occupation without bullets. It came to a head during a security sweep along the Ghanaian border. The mission brief was vague, neutralize suspicious elements, it said. No clear threat, no intelligence dossier, just the usual rhetoric about stability and the importance of joint oversight. Traoré was assigned under Captain Douamba, a man known more for ambition than principle. The day before deployment, Traoré walked into the operations tent and caught the tail end of a hushed conversation. Douamba stood stiffly at attention, nodding toward a foreign advisor speaking on a secure line. On the table between them lay a folder marked with the seal of the French embassy. When the advisor left, Traoré asked cautiously, "Was that an intelligence debrief?" Douamba's eyes narrowed. "You asked too many questions for someone not yet ready for answers." But Traoré had already seen too much. That night, under a flickering light bulb in the briefing room, he found the folder left behind. It wasn't a list of targets. It was a list of assets Burkina-based civilians suspected of interfering with French mining interests, farmers' union heads, even teachers. Among the names was Corporal Malik Sanon, a soft-spoken soldier and Traoré's closest friend. The two had trained together, served together, and more than once talked late into the night about what real independence might look like. Traoré tried to warn him. "Stay out of this mission," he whispered. "Say you're sick, request reassignment." Malik smiled, half confused, half reassuring. "You worry too much. I'm just a soldier." The next morning, a skirmish broke out near a checkpoint, or at least that was the official story. A sudden gunfire exchange. Chaos. When the smoke cleared, Malik was gone, shot in the back. No enemy fire was reported. The explanation was brief and cold. Killed in crossfire. But Traoré knew better. Malik hadn't died by accident. He died because someone somewhere had labeled him inconvenient. That night, Traoré didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat at Malik's empty cot, staring at the blood-stained tag that bore his friend's name. He remembered the colonel's words, "Learn who's listening." But now he asked himself a harder question. What if no one's listening at all? The system wasn't just flawed, it was compromised, infected by deals, made in closed rooms far away, with local commanders acting as middlemen for foreign interests. National security had become a puppet show, with the strings pulled from embassies and boardrooms. That's when Traoré began to change. He started gathering notes, observing patterns, quietly identifying others like him, young officers who had questions in their eyes and fire in their hearts. No manifestos, no speeches, just a handshake here, a glance there. He was building something cell by cell, heart by heart. Not a rebellion, not yet. Just a network of memory, a ledger of truth carried by men who refused to forget. From that moment forward, Traoré walked differently. He spoke with precision, calculated who stood where, and watched which officers checked their phones during meetings and whose screens lit up with foreign numbers. The betrayal was no longer invisible. It had a chain of command, and he would follow it not to obey but to dismantle it. The barracks were never truly quiet, not even at night. The creak of boots in hallways, the soft thud of rifles being cleaned, the low murmurs of restless young men dreaming in foreign tongues all formed a constant, uneasy hum, like the sound of an old engine refusing to die. But beneath that noise, a new frequency had begun to take root. Not loud, not obvious, just barely detectable, like a second heartbeat. It was in the way certain soldiers lingered a moment longer after evening drills, their eyes scanning the courtyard, waiting for the right time to slip away. It was in the coded phrases muttered between sips of cheap tea and the deliberate reshuffling of bunk assignments in the brief but pointed glances exchanged during briefings. It was organized silence, and at the center of it stood Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't call it recruitment. He didn't call it resistance. Those words were too dangerous. What he offered was something smaller, quieter, yet far more dangerous: a question. If this is our country, why don't we control it? The men he spoke to weren't radicals. They weren't rebels. They were sons of farmers, teachers, and masons. Most had never left the country, never known life beyond duty and dry rations. But all of them had seen enough to know something was broken, deeply, deliberately broken. They didn't speak of revolution. They spoke of dignity. Not about seizing power, but about returning it to where it belonged. The meetings happened late, often in the corners of the weapons depot or under the shell of a long-abandoned hangar. They sat on crates and metal drums, whispering above the whine of insects and the wind's dry breath. Traoré never preached. He listened. He asked. He made each man feel like his voice was part of something sacred. They studied maps, not to invade but to understand. They compiled lists, not of targets but of who truly held the strings, the officers taking foreign calls, the depots rerouting weapons, the bases whose fuel shipments never matched the records. It was slow, careful work, not the birth of a coup, but the quiet construction of clarity. One night, after a long meeting with 5 trusted comrades, Traoré lingered behind. The moon was low, the air thick with the smell of rust and oil. One of the soldiers, a lean young marksman named Bakari, turned to him before walking away. "We're not dreaming, are we?" he asked, voice low, half afraid of the answer. Traoré looked out across the yard, where the national flag hung limp in the windless dark. "No," he said, "we're remembering." Bakari nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Alone now, Traoré stood for a long moment in the quiet. The night was still, almost too still. The kind of silence that makes you think the world is holding its breath. One day he whispered almost to himself, "The flag will belong to us again." And with that he turned and walked back into the barracks, a soldier among soldiers, but carrying in his chest a storm that would one day be heard across the world. The sky above Ouagadougou that September night was thick with stillness. No stars, no breeze, just a velvet shroud of waiting. The kind of darkness that didn't fall like evening, but descended like judgment. In the capital, streetlights flickered uncertainly, and the humming of distant generators slowed to a whisper. Inside, homes' radios went static. Phones stopped ringing. Signals vanished, not jammed, but severed. It was 02:37 a.m. Somewhere in the city, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a dog barked once and then went silent. But no one knew what was happening yet. Not the vendors asleep beside their wooden carts. Not the students cramming for exams by candlelight. Not even the ministers in their air-conditioned rooms. Only a few did. They were already moving. The coup didn't begin with a speech. It began with footsteps. Quiet ones. Measured ones. Boots gliding over dirt and tile and concrete. Armed units emerged from bases like veins of shadow, moving in perfect coordination across 6 key locations: the national television station, the presidential residence, the communications ministry, the central armory, the military airport, and the security command center. No gunfire, no shouting, only silence and synchronized momentum. In one group, Ibrahim Traoré led 4 men through a utility tunnel beneath the Ministry of Defense. He said nothing. His eyes were locked forward, calculating. Each step was choreographed. Each second mattered. In his vest pocket, pressed against his chest, was the folded page from his hidden journal, the one that read, "One day we must no longer ask permission to be free." He wasn't asking anymore. By 03:12 a.m., the presidential guards had been disarmed. Not with bullets, but by confrontation, surrounded, outmaneuvered, and shown documents they never thought existed: bank records, foreign transfer logs, orders signed with embassy seals. Most guards didn't resist. A few looked away ashamed. One man saluted. At 03:45 a.m., the national broadcaster was seized. The news anchor, half asleep, still in a wrinkled shirt, was handed a paper and told to read when given the cue. He stared at the words with disbelief. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't a declaration of conquest. It was something else. Something careful. At 04:00 a.m., the lights across the Capitol surged, then stabilized. The screen lit up. The world watched as a young man in military fatigues stepped into frame. No podium, no entourage, no flags behind him. Just him, a single microphone, and a new chapter in Burkina Faso's long bruised history. He cleared his throat, looked directly into the lens. People of Burkina Faso, tonight we take back what was always ours. We are not rebels. We are not here for power. We are the guardians of a dream long buried under silence. From this day forward, this land answers to its own voice. He paused. No slogans, no chants, only breath. There will be no violence, no looting. This is not revenge. This is reclamation. Outside in the pre-dawn haze, people slowly stepped into the streets. First by twos, then by dozens. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the world had changed. Men and women stared at each other, as if searching for confirmation that they weren't dreaming. By sunrise, every radio in the country repeated the same phrase. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has assumed responsibility for the transitional restoration of national sovereignty. There were no parades, no fireworks, but something unspoken filled the air. Something that had not existed in Burkina Faso for a long time. Dignity. A teacher wiped his glasses in disbelief. A farmer kissed the soil. A young boy in a slum looked up at the flag fluttering above the schoolyard, and for the first time felt like it meant him. And in the darkness of his temporary command post, Traoré sat at a desk littered with reports, breathing slowly. The first storm had passed, but more would come. He knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning. The sun had barely broken the horizon when the city of Ouagadougou stirred to life beneath a sky that felt different, not because of color or cloud, but because of the silence that held the streets like breath before thunder. There were no military trucks rumbling down the avenues now. No panic, no looting. Just people watching, waiting, whispering. Children sat on curbs beside their parents' radios, crackling to life with static. Cell phones buzzed with uncertainty. Shops stayed closed, not from fear, but from reverence. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the cameras went live again. But this time the scene was different. No polished desk, no national insignia hanging from velvet drapes, no security detail in dark suits standing behind bulletproof glass. Just a single microphone, a plain, rusted podium. A man in olive fatigues, his collar slightly wrinkled his face, calm but unsmiling, his eyes focused like a man who had seen fire and chosen to walk into it anyway. Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked straight into the lens, not like a politician, not like a soldier, but like someone who had nothing to hide and everything to say. He took a breath. No teleprompter. No notes. Just voice. To the people of Burkina Faso, I speak to you not as a ruler, but as a son of this soil. The air outside thickened. Radios were turned up. Rooftops filled with listeners. For too long we have knelt, not out of weakness, but because we were told to. Told that obedience was peace, that dependency was stability, that silence was survival. He paused. We were not born to kneel. He gripped the sides of the podium, his voice gaining force, not volume, but conviction. We are not rebels. We are not soldiers seeking glory. We are the sons of the soil who've returned to clean it, to pull from its roots the hands that were never ours. In embassies across the world, diplomats shifted in their chairs. In Brussels and Paris, statements were drafted. The word coup was scribbled beside phrases like constitutional interruption and fragile democracy. But in the streets of Burkina Faso, people leaned closer to their radios, their hearts pounding not with fear but with fire. This is not the end of democracy. This is its rescue. Democracy is not the flag they hand us while they loot what lies beneath it. It is not the face on aid packages. It is not a script to be read in exchange for minerals. Democracy is the right to decide who we are not, who we are told to be. Gasps echoed through the crowd gathered outside the national broadcaster's headquarters. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth. A boy raised his fist instinctively, not because he understood every word, but because he felt every word. Traoré continued. To the international observers who call this a setback, I say, where were your eyes when our villages were burned for gold? Where were your voices when our children died, digging cobalt for your cars? His voice trembled for just a moment, and in that tremble, 100 years of betrayal shook loose. You say you want peace, then let us build it, not with permission, but with pride. Let our weapons rest, let our mouths speak, and let our land finally belong to those who love it. He stepped back, said nothing more, No anthem played, no flag unfurled, just silence, heavy, sacred, and loud. Later that day, international headlines blared, Burkina Faso falls to military rule, setback for West African democracy, uncertainty grips the region. But in the alleyways and villages and classrooms and bus stops, a different word traveled mouth to mouth, faster than press cables could follow liberation. In the heart of the people, it wasn't a coup. It was a homecoming. And though the sky above them held no thunder, the people of Burkina Faso knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted. The world had just heard their voice, and it could never be unheard again. The world reacted with the precision of an old machine, startled awake. Before the dust had even settled in Ouagadougou, before Traoré's name had finished echoing across African radios, the International Monetary Fund issued a veiled statement. Future disbursements of aid and development packages to Burkina Faso may be reconsidered in light of recent unconstitutional developments. In simpler terms, behave or starve. Within 24 hours, France released a sharper message. The foreign ministry, lips tight and eyes cold, strongly condemned the takeover. They called for a swift return to constitutional order. Behind closed doors, discussions shifted toward economic sanctions, regional pressure, and the quiet orchestration of future transitional arrangements in which Traoré's name was not invited. The United Nations held a brief press conference. The Secretary General expressed concern, emphasized dialogue, and declined to answer follow-up questions. But while press rooms and boardrooms spun the streets of Burkina Faso, pulsed with something else entirely. In Ouagadougou, drums echoed through the neighborhoods, beating like ancient hearts rediscovered. Women danced barefoot in the dusty intersections, waving cloth flags, hand-stitched with the national colors. Children painted Traoré's name across alley walls in chalk and charcoal. There were no instructions, no organizers, just momentum. Just the feeling that something once stolen had suddenly returned. Old men emerged from their homes and leaned on canes, not to protest, but to watch. Some smiled through missing teeth. Others wept quietly behind folded arms. And for the first time in decades, a generation that had never known pride was seeing it etched across their parents' faces. There were no parades, no speeches, just noise, joyful, defiant, alive. Reporters from foreign outlets filmed the crowds with confusion. One British anchor muttered on air, "It's unusual. There's no panic, no looting, just singing." In a makeshift cafe, two students debated softly about what would come next, sanctions, isolation, maybe worse. But even their worry was framed by something steadier, something stronger than fear. "He's not just a captain anymore," one said, eyes scanning the street. "He's something else." And indeed, Traoré was changing, not in body, not in command, but in symbol. His fatigues were now a banner. His face, once unknown, had become an icon, painted on walls, printed on t-shirts, etched into hope. Somewhere he was sitting behind a desk again, reading reports, bracing for storms. But in the minds of his people, he was no longer in a room. He was in the wind. The fire had caught, not just in the capital, but in the bones. And across the sea and cities where suits measured freedom and contracts and stability in silence, analysts whispered what no one dared admit aloud. The boy has lit a match, and he didn't ask for permission. Thousands of miles away from the heat and dust of Ouagadougou, in a soundproof studio nestled inside the polished glass shell of Manhattan, the story was unfolding through an entirely different lens. The Fox News control room buzzed with urgency. Every producer, anchor, and political strategist knew the formula. When a crisis didn't directly touch American soil, it was background noise unless it could be spun into a headline that moved viewers, donors, or both. The headline this time, "African military coup draws global concern, who is this kid captain?" On screen, a grainy loop played again and again. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing still in his olive fatigues, addressing a nation with no notes, no flag behind him, just that voice. Calm, measured, unapologetic. Too unapologetic. In the Beltway's inner circles, the questions were sharper. Is he one of ours? Do we have someone in his cabinet? How do we control the fallout before Russia steps in? But behind the cable news polish and government memos, the reaction was emotional, the kind of emotion masked as policy concern. This was not about Burkina Faso's borders. This was about the audacity of a young African captain standing before the world declaring sovereignty without asking anyone's permission. and for certain people that made him dangerous. The White House avoided public commentary, opting for generic lines about regional stability. The State Department leaned on ECOWAS to make noise. But in the shadows of think tanks and dinner briefings, the conversation turned theatrical, and theatrical problems demanded theatrical responses. So they made a call. Pete Hegseth, decorated veteran, patriot poster boy, host of Fox and Friends Weekend. A man known not only for his rugged charm and straight-talk delivery, but for speaking directly to a demographic that mattered: older Americans with cable subscriptions and voting power. The pitch was simple: go to Burkina Faso, sit with him, call it a journalistic profile, but push hard. Pete didn't blink. He leaned back in his leather studio chair, eyes locked on the playback monitor showing Traoré's speech. The audio was off. He didn't need to hear the words, the uniform said enough. "So what is he?" Pete asked, his voice half amusement, half irritation. "Another Che Guevara knockoff." "No," replied one producer. "Too clean for that. Too composed. But he's gaining traction. We need to put a frame around him fast. If we don't tell America who he is, someone else will." Pete turned back to the screen. For a moment he studied the captain's face. Young, clear-eyed, too confident. He smirked. "I'll take him apart in under 10 minutes, he said. But beneath the bravado was something more subtle, a flicker of curiosity. Pete had confronted senators, activists, and generals. He grilled college professors and war survivors alike. He was sharp-fast, used to winning the verbal chess matches of primetime television. But this was new territory. Still, he relished the opportunity. Not just to challenge Traoré, but to reclaim control of the narrative, to show the American audience that this so-called revolutionary was just another strongman in fatigues, another idealist who'd collapse under the weight of a few sharp questions and a live camera. "Book it," he told the team. "Tell him it's a special feature, the future of Africa. A conversation on sovereignty and global responsibility. Make it sound diplomatic." And just like that, the wheels began to turn. Visas, security clearance, media escorts. A well-dressed confrontation was in motion, polished smiles and clipped sound bites, on the surface loaded tension underneath. What Pete didn't know, what none of them knew, was that across the ocean, in a country they still thought of as pliable, a man was preparing not to defend himself, but to speak with the kind of truth that no framing could soften. The board was being set, and the next move would be played on camera with the world watching. The room wasn't made for television. The walls were chipped concrete, painted over too many times in shades of beige that still couldn't hide the decades of heat and tension. A single oscillating fan squeaked overhead, pushing around air that smelled of dust, sweat, and aging electrical cords. A folding table served as the centerpiece. 2 chairs, one camera directly ahead, one to the left for over-the-shoulder shots. A boom mic dangled like a vulture. The crew, half American, half local, worked in hushed urgency, adjusting lighting filters and triple-checking the feed to New York. The air was wrong, thick, charged. Not with fear, but something stranger, the sense that this moment might outgrow the frame it was being forced into. Pete Hegseth arrived dressed not for war, but for television combat. Dark navy suit, open collar, pocket square. No tie, a subtle nod to informality. He flashed the crew a smile that was equal parts ease and authority. He moved through the set like a man who'd done this 1,000 times, which he had. He sat first, adjusted the angle of his chair to favor his dominant side, glanced at the lens. "Let's keep it clean," he told the director. 3 wide takes 2 cutaways. "Give me 20 minutes clean, I'll take care of the rest." A crew member nodded. Another mopped his brow. Then from the far hallway, Ibrahim Traoré stepped in. No entourage, no aide. Just a pressed uniform and eyes that scanned every inch of the room before landing calmly on Pete. They shook hands. It was brief, firm, no squeezing, no posturing. Captain Pete said with practiced warmth, "Thank you for making the time." "I have time for questions," Traoré replied, "as long as the answers are respected." It was not a threat. It was a boundary. The 2 men sat. The director counted down 3, 2, and they were live. Pete began with charm. "Africa's youngest head of state," he said, smiling toward the camera. "Some call you a visionary, others a disruptor. How do you describe yourself?" Traoré didn't blink. I am neither. I am a servant of my people. Pete nodded as if indulging a line rehearsed too many times. Let's talk about that. You seize power in a military coup, no election, no mandate. Some say that's not service. That's dictatorship. What would you call it? The tone had shifted gently but noticeably. The smile was still there, but now it had teeth. Traoré leaned slightly forward. Would you call George Washington a dictator? He too wore a uniform when he refused foreign rule. Pete smiled again, broader this time, a signal that the real game had begun. You've spoken strongly against Western influence, Pete continued. Your speech criticized France, questioned the IMF, and even took a jab at the United Nations. Are you anti-West or just anti-accountability? A flicker of movement from the cameraman. One of the assistants froze eyes, darting to Traoré. I'm anti-predator, Traoré said calmly. Anyone who feeds on the poor, whether they come from Paris or Pretoria, is my concern. Pete's voice dipped half a register, lowering to the tone he used with guests he was ready to dismantle. Captain, are you aligned with Russia? The question hit like a thunderclap. Behind the camera, someone inhaled sharply. Your foreign minister was seen in Moscow. Russian flags have appeared at your rallies. People are wondering, have you traded one master for another? Traoré let the silence breathe. Then people carry whatever flag represents resistance. That is a reflection of abandonment, not allegiance. It was a rare crack in the wall, not in logic, but in pain. Pete pressed harder. So are you saying the West abandoned Burkina Faso? I'm saying we were never adopted. We were only leased. The room felt suddenly too small for the conversation. Outside, the city simmered beneath the late morning sun. Inside, the interview rolled on, calm on the surface, explosive beneath. This was no profile piece. This was not a conversation. This was a collision of empires, of histories, of truths unprepared for microphones. And it wasn't over yet. The interview had gone on for nearly 20 minutes, but it was in the 21st that time stopped. The studio lights hummed. Sweat gathered at the nape of a producer's neck. Behind the camera, a young intern gripped her clipboard just a little tighter. And at the center of it all sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, expression unreadable, body still, eyes locked on Pete Hegseth, who was preparing to land his final blow. Let me ask you directly, Pete said, tone sharpened to a fine edge. You claim to fight for sovereignty, yet you isolate your nation from the global community. You reject Western aid, insult democratic partners, and refuse to align with established systems of progress. So I'll ask plainly, Captain, why do you keep pushing the West away? The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Traoré didn't answer immediately. He looked at Pete, then past Pete, directly into the camera lens. It wasn't just a glance, it was a stare. Calm, deep, the kind of gaze that bypasses questions and looks for memory instead. The room grew still, and then in a voice that was neither raised nor hurried, he spoke. You ask me why I pushed the West away. A pause. I ask you, when were we ever truly embraced? The words landed like thunder in a closed room. When your banks funded the regimes that stole our land, was that partnership? When your soldiers protected mining contracts but not our children, was that democracy? When your cameras filmed our famines but ignored the hands that caused them, was that justice? Pete blinked. Traoré continued, voice even, but rising, not in volume but in weight. You see a flag change and call it instability. We see a boot lifted and call it breath. You offer us loans bound in chains. You offer us aid priced in silence. You say we turn from you. Another pause. But you were never facing us. Behind the glass, one of the American technicians lowered his headset slowly, forgetting he was still on comms. Someone in New York whispered, "What the hell just happened?" Traoré leaned in slightly, not with aggression, but with something rarer certainty. We are not anti-West. We are pro-ourselves. We are not isolationist. We are recentering. And if that feels like rejection, then perhaps it is only because your arms were never truly open. He sat back. Silence, not awkward, not staged, but full, holy. Pete opened his mouth, then closed it. His script had run out, his tempo broken. He glanced at his cue card, then at the crew. Nothing came. The countdown clock for segment timing flashed red, but nobody moved. The 90 seconds had passed. But something irreversible had been said. The interview ended as all revolutions do not with noise, but with realization. By that evening, the clip had gone viral, but not in the way the producers intended. It didn't air as a hit piece. It wasn't clipped into talking points. It was shared raw, full unedited. A caption on one post read, "This man just redefined the conversation." Another, not a soundbite, a turning point. And somewhere in Washington, a communications team gathered around a monitor watching the interview on loop, understanding, finally, that the narrative wasn't theirs anymore. By the next morning, the internet had split into two realities. In one, Ibrahim Traoré was a threat and untested strongman with poetic rage and dangerous clarity, a populist in camouflage, an ideologue dressed as a reformer. Western headlines shifted rapidly from confusion to condemnation. The Guardian, the soldier who stared down the West Lemon, Burkina Faso at a crossroads, reform or radicalism, Fox News Online. Traoré, calm voice, cold intention segments, aired on back-to-back cable slots. Some anchors praised his composure, but questioned his loyalties. Others labeled him charismatic but destabilizing. Think tanks issued briefs with titles like The Traoré Doctrine and Africa's Rising Firebrand, a cautionary figure. But in between the noise, a quieter audience was watching and remembering. In a VFW hall in Peoria, Illinois, a group of retired veterans sat in front of a grainy TV screen, replaying the now viral 90-second clip. Most of them had served in Korea, Vietnam, or the Gulf. Their world had been built on orders, discipline, patriotism. But it wasn't Traoré's uniform that moved them. It was his voice. "He speaks," one old Marine muttered, "like men did back when we still believed our Constitution was made to be lived, not just quoted." Another nodded slowly. "Reminds me of those early papers, the ones Jefferson and Adams wrote. Lot of pain in their truth, too." They weren't alone. Across senior centers in Pennsylvania, homes in Texas, diners in upstate New York, and porches in the Carolinas, American elders who had grown weary of spin heard something rare. A leader speaking without handlers, without euphemism, without apology. They didn't see a foreign uprising. They saw a mirror cracked but familiar. Meanwhile, Pete Hegseth, the man who had walked into the interview with a pocket full of rebuttals, disappeared from the airwaves. For days, his producers said he was in transition, on leave, reevaluating upcoming content. But insiders knew the truth. He had nothing to say. The interview had aired as scheduled. But it refused to die the way most segments do, buried under 24-hour cycles. Instead, it grew living on message boards, podcasts, and unexpected places. A Reddit thread titled Traoré's America, a veterans Facebook group sharing the full transcript with the caption, "This is what honor sounds like." The ripple was becoming a wave. Politicians began to fumble. Some urged caution, trying to paint Traoré as a populist danger. Others stayed silent, unwilling to alienate growing grassroots support. A few daring congressmen independents mostly praised his message. Senator Malcolm Hunt of Colorado said it best during a town hall. "It's ironic. We sent our cameras to catch a military dictator in the act. What we got back was a lesson in civic virtue, but not everyone was impressed." Editorials in foreign policy journals warned that romanticizing Traoré could open the door to instability, that too much charisma without checks becomes tyranny, that revolutions and fatigues rarely end with ballots. Yet no amount of academic caution could compete with the visceral impact of one man speaking as though the script had finally been burned. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré remained largely off-screen. He issued no follow-up comments, declined further interviews, and returned to meetings, inspections, and rebuilding. But that silence only made the moment louder. He had said what needed to be said, and now the world was left to wrestle with it. In the echo chamber of the West, the sound of Traoré's words kept bouncing off marble walls and studio screens, impossible to mute. And somewhere in the Midwest, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran leaned back in his chair, turned down the volume on the news, and said to his grandson, "That young man, he just reminded us what real independence sounds like." It didn't begin with tanks or treaties. It began with hashtags. In Mali, a college student named Awa Doucouré posted a grainy clip of Traoré's interview with a single line beneath it. "He speaks what we have all been whispering." Within hours, the clip was reshared over 2,000 times. By nightfall, it had crossed into Niger, Togo, and Guinea-Bissau. By the end of the week, the phrase, Where Traoré was trending in 4 languages, French, English, Hausa, and Bambara, across feeds once flooded with celebrity gossip and imported news. But this was different. It wasn't viral, it was ancestral. The movement didn't shout, it hummed low and steady like something ancient being remembered. Young people began to gather not in protest but in purpose. In Dakar University, students organized open-air forums to read Traoré's speech aloud, word for word translating it into local dialects for elders who had lived through actual colonialism. In Niamey, a group of street artists painted a 20-foot mural of Traoré, not as a soldier, but as a tree rooted in cracked soil, rising through chains that had once held it down. In Bamako, a former French government building was found with its tricolor flag missing. In its place, someone had quietly hoisted the Pan-African banner, red for blood, black for skin, green for land. No violence, no statement. Just a photograph posted with the caption, "The ground remembers before we do." One by one, the symbols of old power were unraveled in silence. Outside a colonial-era courthouse, youth leaders in Ouagadougou folded up faded French flags and set them ablaze not out of hatred, but as ritual. They didn't chant. They didn't curse. They simply watched them burn, letting the ashes rise into a sky that had never been asked for permission. No leaders emerged. No political party claimed credit. That was the genius and the warning. This wasn't a revolution led by generals. It was a reckoning led by memory. Western analysts struggled to frame it. The headlines were confused, sterile anti-French sentiment on the rise in West Africa. Youth disengagement from Western governance models. But none of it captured what was happening. The people weren't disengaging, they were finally taking ownership. And Traoré, he said nothing. He issued no calls to action, no statements, no acknowledgments. He simply continued his work, visiting farms, rebuilding supply routes, speaking directly to village councils. His silence became fuel. His absence became legend. To the west, it looked like chaos simmering beneath the surface. But to the people, it was spring, not the season, but the metaphor. Not noisy, not blooming overnight, but creeping quietly beneath decades of frost, cracking through hardened earth, one layer at a time. One young poet from Benin wrote, "We were not waiting for a savior. We were waiting for someone to remind us we never needed one." And perhaps that was the point all along. What Traoré had sparked wasn't a movement around him. It was a mirror, and in it a generation saw themselves not as footnotes in global diplomacy, but as authors of their own beginning. The first shot wasn't fired with a bullet. It came as an email from a foreign bank, a terse notification that Burkina Faso's emergency credit line had been frozen pending review. The next day, 2 of the country's largest aid contracts were abruptly canceled, citing compliance concerns. 3 days later, the central government's encrypted servers were breached. Emails leaked. Documents altered. Power flickered at military posts without explanation. No flags. No soldiers. Just pressure-cold, clinical, deliberate. Traoré had expected this. He had studied enough history to know that when liberation begins, the backlash comes not with tanks, but with ledgers, lawyers, and lines of code. This wasn't a war of ideology anymore. It was a chessboard, and every move came with a cost. He watched as officials began receiving messages from foreign consultants they hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly offering technical support and governance workshops. He saw foreign media outlets ramp up op-eds about instability, subtly urging international bodies to intervene for the sake of the people. An American diplomat requested a meeting privately off record, but came not with advice, only offers Traoré was meant to refuse, so they could say he was unreasonable. But the most dangerous strike came from within. A mid-level intelligence officer, someone Traoré had personally vetted, was caught transmitting encrypted reports to a Western-linked embassy. When confronted, he claimed ignorance, said it was just routine liaison. But his hard drive told a different story: troop movements, supply vulnerabilities, and names. Names of those who had sat with Traoré in the barracks years ago, whispering of flags that might one day belong to them again. Sabotage had come home. Still, Traoré did not falter. He summoned his inner circle. No rage, no spectacle, just quiet resolve. "We knew this road would not be clean," he told them. "Now we know who fears it." And something strange began to happen. Whispers of support arrived from unlikely places. A trade envoy from South Africa quietly extended an invitation to discuss agricultural exchange. An encrypted message came from Ethiopia. We have faced storms. We still stand. Delegates from Guinea and Mali requested a closed-door summit, not to be seen, but to listen, to align. These were not alliances written on treaties or signed in marble halls. They were pacts of understanding forged in the shadows, spoken in tones forged by common history. Former colonies tired of asking, tired of pretending. The board was shifting, and for the first time in a very long time, the West no longer held all the pieces. The shadow war had begun, not with fanfare, not with drama, but with spreadsheets weaponized into silence and silence turned into strategy. But Traoré was no longer alone in the dark. He wasn't the only one who had stopped asking for permission. And as the lights in the war room flickered once more, he leaned forward over the maps and reports a calm fire in his eyes, knowing that he had already crossed the line between man and symbol, and there was no going back. The days grew longer, though the sun hadn't changed. Inside the fortified halls of the Presidential Command Post, a converted colonial administration building, now holding maps instead of ledgers, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone more often than not. The walls, once buzzing with conversation and tactical planning, had turned quiet. Too quiet. One by one, his advisors began to disappear, not by arrest or betrayal, but by exhaustion. Some left without fanfare, others with letters of resignation citing family concerns or fatigue. But the truth was simpler: they were burned out. The revolution had lifted their hearts, but it had not filled their stomachs, nor calmed their families, nor protected them from relentless pressure from abroad. Aid had dried up. Loans were frozen. The Budget Committee reported a 43% drop in accessible government funds. Projects had stalled. The roads promised to farmers remained unpaved. The hospitals they hoped to restock still lacked medicine. The people's faith remained, but faith did not pay for food. And enemies, they multiplied. With every step forward came a dozen hands trying to pull them backward. Media campaigns painted him as unstable. Human rights groups suddenly surfaced with old accusations, each time suspiciously close to summit invitations or military realignments. Every forward breath seemed met with 3 steps of resistance, and in all this he began to feel it not defeat but isolation. Not the loud kind, the quiet one. The one that creeps in late at night when even the walls seem to breathe heavier than you. On one evening long after his security team had rotated out, Traoré remained in the war room. A single lamp cast shadows across the map-strewn table. Markers circled regions in crisis, displaced villagers, blocked supply routes, rising black markets. His pen hovered above a report but never touched the paper. He was tired. Not in the way soldiers are tired after battle. Tired in the way leaders are tired when they realize they've become the thing holding everything together. If he faltered even for a moment, what they had built might collapse under the weight of expectations too large for any man. He stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights flickered in soft rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing behind the glass. Then he returned to his desk, opened the same journal he had written in as a young cadet, and pulled the cap from his pen. He wrote, "I am no longer afraid of death, but I am terrified of becoming irrelevant, of being remembered as fire that could not keep its own hands warm." And then on a new line, "Will I die remembered or simply replaced?" He stared at the question, let it settle. The ink dried slowly in the heat. There were no answers in the room, only maps, numbers, silence. The revolution had many faces, but at that moment in that room, it had only one: his. And it looked older than its years, more burdened than its fame, more human than its legend allowed. He closed the journal, blew out the lamp, and walked out of the room alone, still upright, but carrying the weight of an entire nation's belief pressed between his shoulder blades. It was late afternoon when the car pulled up, unmarked, discreet, diplomatic, in the way things are when they're meant to look like nothing. The guards had not been informed. The protocol team hadn't cleared a schedule. But the woman who stepped out needed no introduction. She moved slowly but confidently, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her linen suit creased not from carelessness, but from long travel. She walked with a cane-polished oak and a presence that didn't require an escort. Helen Dreyfus, former U.S. ambassador to 3 African nations, retired now, but still whispered about in corridors where old diplomats kept old truths. Traoré greeted her at the threshold himself. He was already halfway through a briefing when he was told she'd arrived unannounced. He canceled the rest of the day without apology. They met in a private study, no cameras, no aides, just two chairs, a teapot, and the map of Burkina Faso pinned on the back wall. The sun was beginning to dip, casting gold across the tiled floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Helen sat and gestured toward the pot. "Do you drink?" she asked. "Sometimes," Traoré replied. "Good, because conversation should never begin cold." She poured for both, then leaned back with a breath that was part fatigue, part resolve. "I didn't come to flatter you," she said. "I came to disagree." Traoré nodded. "That's what diplomats do." "But I stayed," she continued, eyes narrowing, "because I started listening." He tilted his head, slightly uncertain. She sipped once, then said, "Do you know what I heard in your interview? Not just anger, not arrogance. I heard something we used to speak about in American classrooms, but forgot how to teach moral courage." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to kindness from that direction. Helen set the cup down gently. "I don't agree with all your methods, and your risks make my old colleagues sweat in their marble offices. But let me tell you something I learned too late in my career. Soldiers may change borders, but it's stories that change nations." Her words hung in the room like incense. She leaned forward. "You don't need the West's approval. You never did, but you also don't need their hatred. What you need, what your people need, is the space to write their own story. No permission, no punctuation added by embassies, just their own language, their own ending." He exhaled slowly. Not relief, not agreement, just understanding. "And you came to tell me this," why, he asked. She smiled, tired but genuine. "Because I used to sit where you're sitting, in my own way, and I want you to survive your revolution. Not just physically, narratively." He looked at her for a long moment, then stood. "Thank you for coming." She rose with effort but dignity. At the door she paused. "Keep the map," she said, nodding toward the wall. "But don't forget, people follow maps, yes, but they remember stories." And with that, Helen Dreyfus left her cane tapping against stone, like punctuation at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. It was not a press conference. It was not framed by gold curtains or national banners. There were no handlers, no journalists, no rows of flags behind him. Just a single wooden podium positioned beneath a tree on the edge of a military compound, the sun carving gentle lines across his face. Traoré stood alone. No teleprompter, no notes. The camera was fixed one angle, no edits. When the video was uploaded, it bore a simple title, "A Message to the World." He didn't begin with greetings. He didn't posture. He simply spoke. "They say we are not ready, that we are too young, too unstable, too loud, that we do not understand the rules of civilization. But I ask what rules and who wrote them." He paused. "Not to think, to let the silence speak. Was it civilized to take our gold and leave us begging for loans? Was it civilized to teach us their language but never teach us how to say no? Was it civilized to draw our borders with rulers on maps while bleeding us into debt?" His voice did not rise, but somehow it thundered. "You do not need to kneel to be considered civilized. You need only stand and refuse to bow." The camera did not move, but across the globe the world did. Within minutes of its upload, the video was subtitled in 45 languages by volunteers. In Kenya, students projected it onto the walls of their dormitories. In Brazil, descendants of Afro-Caribbean slaves passed the link through encrypted group chats. In Vietnam, a retired history teacher included it in a lecture about post-colonial agency. In Detroit, a high school teacher paused his civics class halfway through a lecture on the Founding Fathers. He pulled up the clip, turned to his students, and said, "Watch this. It's what they used to sound like." In Paris, an anchor reluctantly introduced the segment, unable to hide the nervousness behind her practiced neutrality. Up next, she said the message that's making diplomats very uncomfortable. In Ouagadougou, children memorized it like scripture. In small churches and mosques, elders recited lines aloud before prayer. And in living rooms across the world, people who had never heard the name Traoré before watched the video once then again, as if they had stumbled upon something not new but ancient and recovered. It wasn't a speech, it was a key. And the lock it turned wasn't just colonial, it was personal. something shifted. Not loudly, not immediately, but undeniably. There would still be sanctions. There would still be attempts to undermine. But for the first time, the question wasn't about Traoré's power. It was about his clarity. In just a few minutes, he had done what no embargo, no headline, no army could undo. He made people remember who they were before they were told who they had to be. And that is the kind of message that cannot be unsent. In a quiet retirement home outside Wichita, Kansas, a group of elderly veterans sits in a rec room, the television humming softly. The screen flickers with images of Africa, of flags waving in dusty streets, of Ibrahim Traoré standing beneath a tree delivering his now famous speech. None of the men say much. Some sip coffee. Others just watch in silence, their eyes narrowed, not with judgment, but memory. One of them, Harold, a Vietnam vet with faded tattoos, leans forward and mutters, "Reminds me of when we believed in something too." Another nods slowly. "He's got more guts than half of Washington," someone adds. They don't speak of politics. They don't argue about ideology. In that room, it's not about left or right. It's about recognition, the fire of conviction they once carried now burning in a young man continents away. The news anchor continues in the background discussing sanctions and tensions. But the old men don't listen to that. They're watching the look in Traoré's eyes, and they understand something the world keeps forgetting, that truth once spoken has a way of waking even the tiredest souls. Months later, Pete Hegseth returns to Ouagadougou, this time not with hardball questions but with a camera crew and a quieter presence. The trip is part of a new Fox News documentary called After the Interview. But something's different. Hegseth isn't here to trap anyone. He stands in the same room under the same harsh lights where the viral interview happened. This time, his voiceover fills the silence. "I came to challenge a rebel. I left having met a leader." He walks through markets now bustling with renewed energy, interviews locals, listens more than he talks. In his narration, he reflects, "We love to call it democracy until it doesn't look like us. But freedom has many faces, and sometimes we need to get out of the way and let people find their own." Clips roll of Traoré visiting schools, soldiers training under a new doctrine, flags with Pan-African colors flying beside national ones. In the final segment, Hegseth sits alone on camera. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dodge the hard questions. But he made me look inward. That I didn't expect. A beat. And maybe that's what leadership looks like after all. The screen fades to black. Not with applause, but with respect. A small school in northern Burkina Faso. The bell rings. Children run out laughing, kicking dust into the air. One boy lingers behind, seated under a mango tree with a worn paperback in his hands. The cover reads, "The Young Warrior." Inside are sketches, journal entries, and scenes retold not of war, but of courage, of silence, of a man who asked his country not to fight for him, but to stand beside him. The boy reads aloud a sentence underlined in red. "One day we must no longer ask permission to be free." A teacher walks by and smiles. "That's your favorite part again?" The boy nods. "One day I'll write books too," he says. "About what?" He closes the book and says softly, "About the time we stopped waiting." The camera pulls away, catching glimpses of other children reading the same book. The scene fades into the sky. Then a final narrator's voice. "Empires fear armies. But what they fear more is a good story that refuses to die." Sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't loud, it's steady. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise by shouting the loudest, but by standing still in the face of systems built to make men kneel. His story isn't just about politics, it's about dignity, about what happens when a young man decides that silence should no longer mean surrender. It's easy to dismiss voices like his, especially when they don't come wrapped in polished suits or Western approval. But history reminds us truth often begins at the margins. What touched me most wasn't just his courage, but the calm with which he delivered it. In just 90 seconds, he didn't defeat a man, he disrupted a narrative. What do you think? Can one quiet act still shake the world? Or have we grown too used to noise to hear it? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.